Welcome back to the Career Chat with the CCPD. We have a very special guest today in order to be able to talk about employment like ADA, disabilities. Kara, if you could, please tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Kara Maruzak, and I am currently the employment attorney at Owens Corning for our North American insulation business. So how I got here today is I grew up in the Cleveland area and then actually became a Northwest Ohio transplant. I attended Heidelberg University where I had my Bachelor's of Science in Accounting. And then I went on to graduate school at the University of Toledo, where I earned my JD, my Juris Doctor, and my MBA. So following that, I immediately joined Owens Corning in their legal department and have been here for about 5 years.
Great. Thanks so much again for joining us. So we'll get right into the questions regarding disabilities. So how has employment changed for people with disabilities in the last 5-10 years?
Yeah, the last 5-10 years have seen enormous amounts of change. So while the regulatory framework, so laws such as the ADA and other anti-discrimination statutes have been in existence for decades, where I see the biggest change coming is actually from technology. So today, rapid, innovative advances in technology are removing the previous barriers to employment and creating a much more inclusive environment. So I'm seeing things like artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and speech recognition and like talk to text becoming much more common in everyday use. And I continue to see this advance probably in the next 5-10 years to come for sure. So I think it's very exciting when we see on the news new add-ons like you're going to be able to control technology with your eyes. If you want to click on something on your computer screen, it's now going to be able to track eye movement, muscle movement, even brain movement. So when we see this type of technology advancing, this creates new opportunities for people who couldn't use maybe a keyboard or a touch screen. So that's very exciting. And it's also becoming more economically feasible as well. So previously, costs were very prohibitive. Even though the technology existed, not everyone had access to it. And as it becomes more common use, the cost is going down and is widely implemented. So it's very exciting.
That is really exciting. Thank you.
Our next question is, what employment rights do people with disabilities have?
So people with disabilities have many employment rights, but for purposes of this conversation and the limited time, I'm going to focus on 2 of them. First is protection against discrimination, and then the second is reasonable accommodation. So those are the big 2 overarching rights. And the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I'll refer to as the ADA, prohibits discrimination in employment against qualified individuals with disability. So that means if you have a qualified disability as defined under the ADA, you're protected from discrimination in recruiting, hiring, firing, promotion, training, pay, anything that covers the employment relationship. So that's your foundation. But then the ADA also requires reasonable accommodations, and this is super powerful. So an accommodation is any change or adjustment to the workplace to make it easier for the individual to do their job. But by stipulating that the accommodation must be reasonable, employers have to engage with employees in an interactive dialogue to come up with a solution together. So the employer can't say, okay, this is the accommodation, end of conversation. Nor is it one-sided just for the employee. Together, they have to work together and figure out what is the most effective, practical solution. And it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all analysis. Every individual has to be looked at uniquely. So that's super powerful. And The ADA also doesn't take into account hardship and difficulty or expense. So corporations, large corporations, Fortune 500s that are multi-million, multi-billion dollar businesses will have a really difficult time saying, I can't afford this accommodation. So the ADA has specifically covered that piece as well, so expense isn't a barrier. And so a lot of accommodations I see in my work every day, kind of the most practical, most used are, you know, a flexible or modified work schedule, you know, adjustment of training materials, providing new or modified equipment. So this interactive process, I love going through it because I may not have the solution, the employee may not have the solution, but together and relying and involving other people, we can come up with the solution together that neither of us may have thought of.
Can I ask a follow-up on that, Kara?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if someone is working for an employer and they need some type of accommodation, do you recommend that they go to their immediate supervisor or to HR?
So that's a really good question. And I would say you eventually have to go to both. But where you start is kind of your preference. So if you have a better relationship with your manager, start there. Your manager should bring HR in. On the flip side, if you have a better relationship with HR, start with HR, and they're likely going to bring the manager in. So both manager and HR will be involved, but in terms of starting, you can start either place.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Kara, can you tell us what laws people with disabilities should be familiar with when applying for jobs and once they're hired?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a number of different laws. I'll focus on the main federal ones, probably the 5 big federal ones that we see a lot. But I also want to call out that there are a lot of state laws in this area too. So many of the state laws may cover different areas and may be as rigorous, if not more so, than the federal law. But the first one federally is the ADA, which we touched on a little bit before. And the ADA is important because it applies in the private workplace. There's a number of federal laws that protect public workplaces or companies that have federal contracts, but the ADA applies in the private sphere. So the Rehabilitation Act is a big one we see for federal employers, and that prohibits discrimination, and it also authorizes funding for various disability-related purposes and activities. So state vocational rehab programs, independent living, training, research, the National Council on Disability. This all falls under the Rehabilitation Act. And then there's also the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities who apply for, participate, or are employees of any program or organization that receives these federal funds. And so some of these programs are employment and training services for adults, you know, dislocated workers, and vocational rehab programs provided by the Department of Education. And then there's also the Civil Service Reform Act, which covers most federal agencies. So this contains several rules designed to promote fairness in federal personnel actions and prohibit discrimination against applicants. I will also say, if you are a disabled veteran, there's a number of statutes that protect you, particularly based on 1, your veteran status, but also 2, being disabled. So if you are a disabled veteran, I encourage you to look into those as well. And one, for example, is the Vietnam era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act. So there's a lot out there for service members as well.
All right. How do you know when to disclose a disability?
Another great question. And this is a very personal question and really up to each individual based on their own needs. So there's no bright line rule necessary. necessarily that you have to disclose or when you have to disclose. Generally, there is no obligation to disclose disability-related information until the need for accommodation arises. So there's no single right or wrong approach when disclosing your disability. So it's going to vary on some factors of, do I have an obligation? Not necessarily, not at the beginning. But let's say you need an accommodation for the interview process, maybe to enter the building. At that point, the need has arisen for an accommodation, and that's when you should bring it up. I usually see it arise when people are asking for job accommodations. So once they actually get the job, or maybe they're in the job and they're assigned a new task that they can't do, or need some slight accommodation. Or an unusual circumstance comes up. Maybe they have a flare-up and, it's not something they've had to deal with for a while and thought they had it under control. And now a new circumstance has presented itself and they need to talk to their, manager or HR. But what I will tell people is when disclosing a disability, there's a lot of power in how you tell your story and telling it on your own terms. So disclosing your disability allows you to live authentically and come to work with your whole self. And people are often afraid to do so because of retaliation, even though there's numerous laws in place. And so what I encourage people to do is, if you're thinking about disclosing, first figure out, what is your story? What are you going to say? What are you going to specifically ask? So knowing, hey, I need an accommodation because I can't use my computer, or maybe I'm hard of hearing and need a certain phone. How you present that to employers is really important. So instead of, maybe coming off, more negative or defensive, being proactive and positive and putting it in a positive light of saying, I've had this issue come up. I need maybe a different phone. I've looked into it. Here's some options. What can we do to work together? And the tone going in and telling your own story is very important. And I encourage people to think about that before asking for an accommodation. So it sets the tone off immediately on the right foot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great tips. And actually, this is a little bit of the same, but is there other advice that you have for someone with a disability, specifically when they're going through the job search?
Yes. So when going through the job search, first, take advantage of job hunting resources that are specifically out there for people with disabilities. So there's a number of disability advocacy groups and support groups that offer free job training, job placement assistance. There's the Job Accommodation Network. There's the Workforce Recruitment Program. So look into these things, see what they offer, use them to your benefit, and absolutely attend networking events for employees with, or for workers with disabilities, because that can play a really important part to connecting yourself to companies that are already excellent in the accommodation process, working with people with disabilities, and have a great reputation. And finally, don't hesitate to put yourself out there during the interview process. So women especially are less likely to apply for jobs that they may not meet all the criteria for. But even if you don't meet all the criteria, you're not sure if they can accommodate your needs, apply anyhow. Go through that process with them and don't be scared. And once you reach the interview process, be confident. Ask for what you need and really focus on your strengths and abilities. So if you have great experience in this area, focus on that. You don't need to focus on your disability. Your skills will talk for themselves, and you leverage that job experience to really sell yourself. And I will also say the interview process can be a little nervous for both parties. So the applicants undoubtedly, nervous. They might be a little extra sensitive because of their disability, scared of how the employer is going to take it. And the hiring party might be a little nervous as well because they don't want to say anything wrong. They're trying to be politically correct, and it can create a little awkwardness. So going in and being friendly and personal and professional alleviates some of that tension. And if you can break the ice first and make everyone comfortable, it does help in the long run.
Thank you.
How has COVID-19 affected employment for people with disabilities, and how do you think it will affect employment in the future?
Wow, COVID has been a whirlwind this year. So it's definitely impacted employment, period, end of sentence. But it has certainly impacted employment with people with disabilities. So where I see it is one, in our frontline workers who may work on a manufacturing floor, and second are more white-collared professions in the office. And I'll address two groups separately, but a lot of what we were seeing with COVID is if you have an autoimmune disorder, or you're at a high-risk group, or you have a disability that may not allow you to wear a mask, it's very dangerous for you to come out into the public, nevertheless the workforce space. So we were seeing a lot of accommodations to work from home, to see if we could utilize better spacing so nobody comes within 6 feet of each other, additional breaks from wearing masks. And on the salaried side, on the white collar side, it was a little easier to be able to work from home. But especially for people with disabilities, while your personal needs might be met better at home because you have your own bathroom, your own kitchen, your own things, you may not have the appropriate office equipment. So do you have the appropriate monitor? Do you have the appropriate phone, the appropriate chair, those sort of items? So we were seeing also some of requests along those lines. And what I tell people is, if you have a concern, don't be afraid to raise it, and work through it with your manager and your HR partner, because you're definitely not alone with your concern, whatever your medical reason may be. So we're definitely seeing an uptick in this right now. And it's actually made me very excited because a lot of our HR professionals may have not dealt with ADA accommodations. And now we've received so many of them. I think HR in general, and managers especially, have gotten a lot more knowledgeable about this process and broken the ice off that a little bit more. So very excited in that terms, but COVID is going to be a bear to deal with for a while. And I see the need for these accommodations to continue. A lot of employers are doing a great job letting employees work from home. But if that's not your situation, once again, don't be afraid to talk to your employer and try to come up with some ideas to suit your situation.
How can recent graduates with disabilities advocate for themselves in their careers?
So what I tell people, regardless of if you have a disability or not, is you have to be your strongest advocate. And I do think that's especially true for people with disabilities as well. Because if you don't believe in yourself and you don't champion yourself, no one else is going to. And having the confidence to do that really gets you off on the right foot. But then secondly, focus on your strengths and abilities. So there's so much more to you as an individual beyond your disability, and focus on that. And, I think I said before, don't be afraid to take some chances, and don't get discouraged if you don't get, let's say, your dream job or, a job you really wanted. I feel everything works out for a particular reason, and something else was meant for you. So continue chugging on, have confidence, and be your own advocate is the best advice I can give anyone.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much, Kara, for joining us for this career chat. I feel so much more knowledgeable about these topics. Again, we can't thank you enough. I know that our students will appreciate all of your advice and all of the information that you were able to give us. So thanks again. And thank you for joining us for this rendition of the Career Chat, and we'll see you next time.